Hello, William Nichols here. I took a trip to northern New Jersey and interviewed 3 veterans from Vietnam at the VFW Hall. My goal today is to share with you the experiences that these veterans went through, the hard falls, the downfalls, and the hits. After I share with you the experiences and their positions on the government, I am going to share with you my position on the government during Vietnam and also my position on the war. My first victim I interviewed was a Marine. He spent 13 months in Vietnam. He went from an E1 to an E5. In other words, he went in a private and came out a sergeant. Very unlikely, however, because of the injuries and deaths on the battlefield, he got rewarded. He really didn't have a position on the government. His goal was to just go out there and fight for freedom and liberty. He was a Boy Scout, therefore he was one of very few who knew how to orient a compass and a map, even back then, which got him very far. He was also very good with his sense of direction, north, east, south, and west, and very experienced with camping in the wilderness. He came out as sergeant. He's now a chemical engineer and the commander of the VFW Hall. Number 2 was technically not allowed to be drafted, but still joined the Marines. He was an experienced NRA firearms instructor, also a previous Boy Scout. His only position on government is he was against communism and for freedom and liberty, and that's why he fought for the United States. His only regret, having a girlfriend during all this, who disliked him being in the military, fighting in war. The whole 2 years he served, he stayed as a private, and he mentioned the best thing in the military, any branch, is brotherhood. He was basically thrown on the front line, and when he came out, he was awarded honorable discharge. The last veteran I interviewed was in the Army, and was drafted in 1969 by our 36th President, Lyndon Johnson. He spent his training at Fort Dix, and he came out of training as an E3 and left an E5, which again is a sergeant. His one regret, his superiors, his lieutenants, his generals held him back from doing what they should have done, win the war. He spent 7.5 months in the jungle and came out in 1970. His government position, he was for the government. He agreed with what Lyndon Johnson offered him, as well as Richard Nixon, our 37th President of the United States. His initiative was to get the job done. He was in the Battle of Konotun, and despite the fact he never smoked, he's still missing 70% of one of his lungs. He went to Ranger School and was in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He now unfortunately suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. So my opinion on the war. This 20-year extravaganza for the U.S. began way back in the 50s when Eisenhower was sending troops to different parts of the world to stop communism, but it wasn't in Vietnam. It was an island which is now considered present-day Taiwan. John Kennedy later in October of 1961 sent a helicopter to Vietnam, which I believe was a smart thing to do in the help to stop communism. Lyndon Johnson later in 1968 wanted to cease fire and stop the bombing in North Vietnam and wanted to meet up in Paris to settle a peace treaty, but I still believe at this point that relations weren't strong enough to settle that treaty. Richard Nixon, who was previously in the Navy as Lieutenant Commander and President, decided to continue the war, but as a strategist wanted it to end in 1970. He was all for war, but he was all for ending. Nixon pulled his troops out 3 years after he promised that all of them would go home, and it's because of one thing. My third victim had stated they wouldn't let him get the job done. My final statement Although Lyndon Johnson was intelligent with trying to create a peace treaty, he was also too early in trying to make relations because they weren't very strong. In addition, Richard Nixon was too late in ending the war, and it shouldn't have carried out as long as it did. Thank you.